Michael Rivera had been awake for hours before the federal transport van even started moving. He sat in the back, shackled at the wrists and ankles, with two correctional officers beside him. The early morning air was cold, and frost formed thin patterns across the glass, blurring the Colorado mountains outside. He still couldn't believe he was being transferred to ADX Florence, a place inmates whisper about the way people talk about storms they hope never to face. His crime wasn't violent. He hadn't harmed anyone. What he had done was expose a group of officers at his previous prison for smuggling contraband. The moment he spoke up, everything changed. His life became complicated, and the system labeled him a management problem. The drive took hours. Every turn of the road seemed to climb deeper into the mountains, leaving civilization behind. When the van finally stopped, Michael felt the vibration of the engine die out. The doors opened and freezing air rushed inside. He stepped out and took his first real look at the facility. ADX Florence was massive, a sprawling compound of thick gray walls, smooth concrete surfaces, and razor wire arranged in coiled layers. The place didn't look like an ordinary prison. It resembled a heavily fortified military base. Guard towers rose high, each window tinted so dark that he couldn't see inside, but he could feel eyes watching him. As he was led to the outer gates, he noticed how quiet everything was. Other prisons were full of noise, shouting, slamming, officers calling out instructions. But here, the silence settled like a weight over the entire complex. Even the wind seemed muted. Inside the building, every step echoed. He passed through layers of security. Metal detectors, fingerprint scanners, facial checks, and thick steel doors that locked behind him one at a time. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, not literally, but in the way everything felt stripped of warmth. Finally, officers stopped at a hallway of heavy doors. They unlocked one and motioned him inside. Michael stepped into his new home, a cell designed not just to confine a person but to swallow their presence. The door shut behind him, and the silence that followed was unlike anything he had ever felt. He stood in the middle of the cell, letting the realization sink in. This place wasn't meant for correction. It was meant for containment. Total, absolute containment. Michael slowly examined the cell. The first thing he noticed was that everything was built to remove control from the occupant. The bed was a solid concrete platform with a thin mattress. The desk was concrete. The stool was concrete. The toilet and sink were stainless steel, cold to the touch. The door was thick reinforced, with a small slot for food and restraints. And the window, the infamous ADX window, was a narrow vertical slit, no wider than the length of a hand. It was placed high above eye level, forcing inmates to look upward if they wanted to see anything. From where he stood, he could see nothing but a strip of sky, pale and distant. There were no bars to look through, no open space to observe. The design ensured isolation. The world outside existed, but it was invisible. He sat on the concrete bed and felt the hardness pressed through the thin mattress. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, metal, and something colder. Something like emptiness. Time moved slowly here. He had no clock, no watch, no routine yet. All he had was silence. The first meal came through the slot, the metal tray sliding in with a dull scrape. He didn't see the guard's face, only the hand, and then the slot closed again. Michael ate mechanically, not because he was hungry, but because eating was the only action he could perform that broke the stillness. Hours passed. He paced the cell from wall to wall, learning that it took him exactly 8 steps to cross the length of it. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, listening to the faintest distant noises, doors closing far away, maybe someone yelling in another unit, though the sound was distorted by layers of concrete. He tried sleeping, but the lights never turned fully off. They only dimmed slightly, enough to remind him that he was being watched at all times. Days blended into each other quickly, but each individual hour dragged on as though it refused to end. In a normal prison, noise was unavoidable. But here, silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was an active presence, something that pressed against him, reminding him that no matter how loudly he might shout, the world outside would never hear him. Michael learned the ADX routine quickly, though routine felt like the wrong word. Nothing changed. Every day mirrored the last. At around 5 a.m., the lights brightened. Breakfast arrived shortly afterward. The food was basic: oatmeal, bread, and a piece of fruit. Sometimes eggs, sometimes cereal. Always through the slot, always without a word. He tried to keep his mind steady by exercising. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing. After a few weeks, he knew the exact number of steps around the room, the exact number of push-ups he could do before his arms gave out, the exact amount of time it took for his body to warm up in the cold air. He talked out loud to keep his voice familiar. Some days he recited childhood stories. Other days he repeated the same phrase over and over just to break the silence. He showered inside a small shower area inside the cell, controlled remotely by staff. His only break came during recreation. Guards cuffed his hands behind his back through the slot, escorted him through multiple doors, and brought him to what they called the yard. But it wasn't a yard at all. It was a concrete enclosure the size of a small garage, with walls too tall to see over. A metal grate covered the top, and the sky was visible only through the holes in the grate. No grass, no open space, just concrete, air, and a patch of sunlight that moved slowly across the ground as the day passed. Even so, Michael treasured that hour. Sometimes he stood in the sunlight, eyes closed, letting the warmth sink into him. Sometimes he walked in slow circles, feeling the earth beneath his feet. And then the hour ended, and he returned to his cell for the other 23 hours. The days passed, marked only by meals and the slow movement of light through the window slit. Weeks turned into months. Conversations with staff were rare, short, and procedural. Everything was controlled. He learned to survive by creating structure, counting steps, organizing his belongings, memorizing details of the cell, writing imaginary letters in his mind. Without these small routines, his thoughts would start drifting into territory he couldn't afford. As the months accumulated, Michael began noticing changes in himself. Isolation wore down the sharpness of his thinking. He forgot small details from day to day: what he ate, what he dreamed about, which letters he had written months ago. Sometimes he woke up unsure of whether he had been asleep for an hour or half a day. The silence grew heavier. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like being underwater. There were moments when he thought he heard someone call his name, but there was no one there. Other times he thought he heard footsteps outside his door, but no footsteps came. One night, he heard faint tapping inside the ventilation system. At first he thought it was a pipe, but then it came again, short, deliberate taps, spaced evenly. He tapped back. Over days, those taps grew into a pattern. Michael realized someone on the other side of the wall was sending messages. Eventually, whispers came through the vent. He never learned the man's real name. They didn't exchange details that could put them at risk, but they spoke about survival, about memories, about the few things inside the walls that made them feel human. Talking through the vent became an anchor for Michael. It reminded him he wasn't completely alone. It gave him a sense of time, of continuity, of shared experience. But the solitude still crept in. Sometimes he paced for hours without realizing it. Sometimes he felt the walls closing in. Sometimes he sat on the bed and stared at the window slit for nearly an hour, waiting for the sky to change color, so he could mark another day. The strangest part of isolation wasn't the silence. It was the way silence made his thoughts louder, sharp in some areas, foggy in others. He learned that the mind could both protect and betray a person. He was determined to survive, but he understood now why many didn't. After months of silence, Marcus finally received something that felt almost unreal. A small privilege notice slid through the door slot. At first, it seemed trivial. Slightly longer recreation, access to a few books, limited privileges to move a little more freely. But in ADX, every tiny change was a lifeline, a crack in the walls, a reminder that life beyond concrete existed. The day the guard slid a paperback novel into his cell, Marcus held it reverently. The smell of paper, the feel of pages, the weight of it in his hands. Things he had taken for granted outside suddenly felt sacred. He traced his fingers across the cover, memorizing every crease and scratch. For the first time in months, his mind wandered beyond the cell. He imagined reading under the sun, flipping pages without counting steps or tracking the echo of silence. Recreation became more than exercise. It was a ritual. He walked a small concrete yard, feeling the mesh above filtering the sky. He ran laps in circles he had mapped months ago, not just to keep his body strong, but to feel control returning to him, piece by piece. He noticed shadows shifting with the sun, listened to distant sounds, a bird, a cough, a door in another block, each one a reminder he wasn't erased from the world. Then came voices. A guard spoke to him, only a short sentence. Step forward. Turn around. Practical, unremarkable, but Marcus froze. He realized he hadn't heard a human voice directed at him for weeks. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he whispered his own name aloud, marveling at the sound of it. Mail call became sacred. Letters from family arrived sporadically, handwritten words on lined paper, each one a connection to the world he had forgotten. He read them over and over, memorizing phrases, imagining his sister's voice as she wrote each word. Each letter anchored him, reinforcing the belief that life outside the walls continued, and that people still waited for him to return. One evening, he noticed a bird gliding past a narrow window slit, just a shadow with wings, but enough to bring warmth to his chest. He followed its flight with his eyes until it disappeared, letting himself feel something he had almost forgotten. Hope. That hope grew steadily, carried by the rhythm of reading, writing, exercising, and breathing in the faint, filtered sunlight that peeked through the bars. For the first time in months, silence didn't feel like a weapon. It was still heavy, still omnipresent, but cracks of life seeped through, and Marcus began to embrace them. Each small freedom became a victory. A book in hand, a bird in the sky, a letter from home, a voice to answer. In ADX, survival was no longer just enduring. It was noticing the little threads of life, clinging to them, and remembering who he had been before the walls closed in. The counselor arrived one morning and spoke through thick glass, reviewing Marcus's mental state. Every behavior, every habit, every measure of discipline had been recorded meticulously. ADX didn't reward emotion, remorse, or bravery. It rewarded survival. It rewarded stability. And Marcus had earned it. Weeks later, a panel of officers reviewed his file in a sterile room. Chains hugged his wrists. A small cardboard file held his life in bureaucratic form. The words step-down transfer were simple, but they carried the weight of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Marcus barely believed it at first. He had been trained to think nothing could penetrate ADX. Yet here it was, movement beyond the walls, beyond silence. Packing his few belongings, Marcus realized how little he owned. Letters, a book, some worn papers, a life compressed into a shoebox. He handled each item with care, almost ceremonial. Every fold, every crease, was a relic of a self that had survived the unthinkable. The walk down the corridor felt surreal. Same concrete, same lights, same echo of boots, but the weight of anticipation made the air almost tactile. Guards flanked him, silent but watchful, leading him to a van that would take him away from the fortress that had consumed his body, his voice, and his sense of time. He didn't run. He didn't celebrate. He moved deliberately, absorbing each second, each step as though proving he could reclaim the world he had been taught to forget. Outside, the air was different. He inhaled deeply. The sky stretched farther than he remembered. Colors seemed brighter. Wind brushed against his face. The 23-hour silence that had followed him like a shadow for months was finally behind him. Inside the van, Marcus looked back at the fortress shrinking in the distance. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a threshold. ADX had tested him mentally, stripped him of routine, hope, and voice. Yet he had survived. Every moment of terror, isolation, and quiet had led to this, the simple act of leaving. As the landscape passed, he thought about small freedoms. The book he had read over and over, the letter from home, the bird flying past a window slit, the faint taps from unseen prisoners he had once communicated with. Those moments had preserved him, shaping resilience stronger than any physical chain. When the van turned a corner and the walls disappeared from sight, Marcus realized the silence hadn't defeated him. It had refined him. ADX could contain his body, but it could not contain his mind. And that mind, scarred but unbroken, was now free.